Hello there, thanks for joining me today. I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts from God's Word with you. Thanks so much for being with all of us today. We're so glad that you're here. So whether you've been checking in week after week and you're a regular, or whether you're new and just checking us out, say hello, get connected. I think you'll enjoy being with Festival Church today. And we're in a little mini series at the moment where we're taking 3 Sundays out to look at this little series called The Household of Faith. And so this is the middle Sunday. Last week, Pastor Kaz did a great job talking about unity. Next week, we're looking forward to hearing Pastor Anthony, talk about missions. So it's Mission Sunday next week. But today, I want to speak about being God's curators. I've got this great picture here of an art gallery, and I reckon this is our curator here in this particular gallery. I don't know about you, but I do quite enjoy visiting museums and galleries. I think I'm getting better at planning my visits. There was definitely a time where you find yourself in London for the day and you try and get around as many museums and galleries as you can, and your feet end up killing, and you realise you can't remember what the last picture actually looked like. You started off, standing in front of the picture, just kind of letting it, just soaking it up, reading a little bit of information, then moving on slowly to the next picture or work of art. By the end of it, you're just walking past them because you've had enough. Art fatigue. Or even in museums, they're so big sometimes and you want to get around it, you end up just walking past those exhibition cabinets. I think my favourite museum is the British Museum in London. I quite like the Egyptian section and the Babylonian section. But behind, every art gallery, every museum, there's a curator. Someone who is tasked with looking after stuff that doesn't belong to them. They have this job of collecting, presenting, looking after, helping visitors find a really good way through the museum or gallery so it all makes sense. I only realised fairly recently that the stuff we see on display is a tiny fraction of what that museum or art gallery actually tends to own. I'd love to go to their archives or their cellars and see what they're hiding away. But it's just this job of the curator to look after stuff well, take care of stuff that doesn't belong to them. In fact, the word curator comes from a Latin word which means to care. I love that. A curator's job is to care for objects and paintings and present them really, really well. And in many ways, we are God's curators with regard to the world around us. There's this lovely verse in the Psalms, which I think you'll be familiar with. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. The world and all its people belong to him. Psalm 24. Oh, this wonderful creation, this world around us isn't ours. It belongs to God. The emphasis here down to the people in it, us, everything in the world belongs to him. And it's quite challenging that. I don't know how well us as humanity have looked after this amazing creation, and maybe this should be more part of our testimony, our story as Christians, to look after this wonderful world that God has entrusted to our care as his curators, looking after stuff that doesn't belong to us. That's the story of Adam and Eve in the garden in Genesis, Garden of Eden. It says the Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. We have this responsibility to look after all that God has entrusted to our care. Now, you won't find this phrase curator in the Bible, I'm sorry to say. We don't find anywhere, be God's curators. But we do find another word for it. It's the word steward. The idea of stewardship is quite strong in the Bible. Here's some great verses about being stewards. 1 Peter 4 verse 10 says, each of you should use whatever gift you've received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. Each of you, that means all of us, should use whatever gift we've received to serve others as faithful stewards. Think about all the stuff that you have, all the good gifts that you have in your life, stuff that you know has come from God. I love the way that James talks about God's gifts and says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Think of all the blessings in your life, all the good things that you enjoy. Do you ever think about them as gifts from God? That all that's been entrusted to your care belongs to Him. Everything about us, it comes from Him. Are we good stewards? Are we good curators? What does the art gallery of our life look like? Here's another great verse, which is a famous stewardship verse, if you like, in Corinthians. Moreover, it is required of stewards that they be found faithful. This is a requirement of every single one of us. Whether you're joining us today as someone who might call themselves a Christian or not, I think by just being a man or a woman, by being a human being, we have a responsibility to be faithful to the good things in the world, the good things entrusted to our care. I believe strongly that the world, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. And these verses about being good stewards are quite challenging. We are all called to be faithful. So what does the art gallery of your life look like? If you were the curator, well, you are the curator, if you like, of all the gifts that God has given you. But if you had to have stand back objectively, and if you like, give yourself a score perhaps, how are you doing as a curator of all that God has entrusted to your care? I've noticed that there are three things in life that we certainly see from a biblical perspective, three areas that are quite challenging, that we have to be extra attentive to. Work hard at making sure we are being God's curators well in these three areas. And they are treasure, time, and talents. The treasure that God has entrusted to you. Are you being a faithful curator? The time that God has given you. Are you being a faithful curator? And what about your talents? How are you using those gifts to serve others? These are three areas, and there is so much we could talk about, especially in terms of life, church, family life, work life, the natural world. These are three areas that I think we have to be intentional in. And when I read the Bible, and if you haven't read the Bible before, I'd encourage you to do so. But I know many of you do read it, and you'll notice that there's a group of people that almost like are an example to us. And it's the children of Israel. And we find their story really in the Old Testament. And it's like the Old Testament is full of principles and practices that are seeded and come to fruition through Jesus in the New Testament and the life of the church. And I've noticed that in the life of the children of Israel, there were certain practices that were put in place to make sure that they, as a family of people, were good curators when it came to treasure, time, and talents. And I think they're principles that hold fast into the New Testament. They actually come to fruition, if you like, in the New Testament. Principles I think we could learn from to help us in the here and now be God's curators. So here's the first principle I see associated with time. And it's Sabbath, the Sabbath. You might be familiar with the phrase the Sabbath, or, it's one of the 10 commandments that we read in the Old Testament. The children of Israel were told to keep the Sabbath day holy. The Sabbath was a day set aside for rest and to worship God. In the life of the culture of the Old Testament, that was the equivalent to our Saturday. And they would not work on that day because it was a day of rest and a day to worship. I think actually we should keep this principle today. We should keep Sabbath as a way of getting off onto a good footing when it comes to being a good God's curator of time. I would encourage you to think about how you're taking time out to rest and to worship. There's this verse in the New Testament that talks a little bit about the Sabbath. And then I'll just shorten it right down. It simply says, it's in Mark 2, verse 27, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath, Jesus affirms the Sabbath principle, I would say, in our lives, in the here and now. Now, it can be quite trendy these days to talk about Sabbath, but it's often talked about only as half the picture. Because we'll often hear, you must take time out, you must rest. And we must do that, and do that. Make sure that you're resting and taking time out. But that's only half the story, because the Sabbath principle is take time out to rest and to worship. If you want to be a good curator of the time that God has given you, then I think you need to be intentional about the Sabbath principle. You need to take time out regularly, diarize it, to rest and worship. That's the first thing. Keep the Sabbath principle. Here's the second thing, and it's around our treasure. Now, in the Old Testament, there was this principle of the tithe. So if Sabbath is something that we keep, so keep Sabbath, tithe is something that is given. So the tithe in the Old Testament, in the lives of the children of Israel, was 10% of their produce given back to God. It was a way of saying to God, God, everything I've got is from you. I'm just a curator here. And to show that I understand that and love you and worship you, I'm making sure I'm giving 10% of all I'm producing back to you. And they did that by bringing the 10% of their produce to the house of God. So when you often hear in our church circles talking about tithes and offerings, we're actually talking about this principle about bringing our best financially to God. Not many of us could bring 10% of our corn or our wheat harvest to God, like perhaps the children of Israel did. We don't live in that kind of world. Our produce today is the money that we earn. There's a principle here that to be God's curators with the treasure He's given us, we should make sure we are generous with it, that we're quick to give it away to bless others, to bring it to the house of God, so that the household of faith runs well too. It's the principle of the tithe, bringing a proportion of what we earn back to God. I would say it's a practice that we should integrate into our lives. People often ask, well, should we bring 10% or should we bring this amount or that amount? Where's this in the New Testament? I'm talking about the principle today of generosity. And I see this practice in the Old Testament affirmed. My guess is, if we were to really unpack this, the New Testament talks about giving everything away. Now, I'm not suggesting that today, but I am saying that we should be thinking intentionally about how we bring everything about us back to God. So here's the verse, to think about in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2. On the first day of every week, this is Paul talking to the church, each of you should set aside a sum of money in keeping with your income. In keeping with your income, so proportional. Saving it up. So then Paul says that when I come, no collection will have to be made, because he was going to take this great gift of their resources to bless the church in Jerusalem. Have a think about that. 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2. Whenever I speak to people about generosity, everyone wants to be more generous. Everyone would love to give more away. We often think we have to get more before we do that. No, we don't. The principle of proportionality and percentage is so important. I think we can all start now in being intentional. Okay, final one. Here we go. What about our talents? Where do we see that in the Old Testament? Oh, it's harder to see, to be honest, in terms of a really solid principle. So we've had Sabbath for time, tithe for treasure. And do you know, I had to actually go to the New Testament to find this Old Testament principle. Because we don't actually see it, if, for example, in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt be hospitable. But we do know that in the life of the culture of the children of Israel, hospitality was just so built in. It was a way of life. And it's in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. It says, do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers. For by so doing, some people have showed hospitality to angels. And I'm told by commentators that this is a direct reference to the story of Abraham, where he showed hospitality to strangers, and they turned out to be angels. So I'm seeing this as an affirmation of hospitality, as a way of using our talents to serve others. I think we should have a good long look at all the stuff that God has given us, and make sure we're using it to serve Him by serving each other. Hospitality is all about making sure that people don't feel like strangers. It's all about helping people feel connected and part of the story of God in the world today. And God gives us these talents and giftings in our lives, our strengths, if you like, to help people to help each other on that journey. It's part of being good stewards. It's part of being God's curators in the world today. So I love the way that these three areas that are quite challenging, time, treasure, and talents. Actually, the Bible has a lot to say to help us practically be intentional in these areas. Why? So that we can be faithful stewards of all that God has given us. So, in our Household of Faith mini-series today, I'm talking about stewardship. But I'm saying let's be God's curators. Let's be challenged, and let's do our best to honour God with these things. Let's be great stewards of time. Let's be great stewards of finances. Let's be generous. Let's be good stewards of the talents that God has put in our lives. Well, it's been great to share with you today. Lots to think about. I pray God's continued blessing in your lives. See you soon.